We're really excited to be able to offer this webinar as a piece of what normally last year at this time would have been the Big East Women's Networking Luncheon. And we all know what's happened in the last year to have changed this, and this was one of the big events that Villanova had created to be in person in New York at this time, and it was one of the first things that we had to cancel as a result of the COVID crisis. And we're really excited to be able to pull all of those panelists that we invited last year here for this virtual event. This event is co-sponsored by the Ann Walsh McNulty Institute for Women's Leadership at Villanova University and is now in its, I believe, 4th year, which is really exciting to see. The topic today is women and board leadership, and we know that women's representation in board leadership has been slowly increasing, but we still have a lot of large disparities. These governance boards that steer both corporate and nonprofit organizations are critical power positions, and therefore an aspect of women's leadership development that many people have interest in. As such, our panelists will be addressing this topic, as well as some other leadership development conversations here. I'm extremely thrilled to be able to introduce Sarah Frances Bland, who will be moderating this panel and guiding us through the session. A couple of notes before that in terms of logistics. The chat has been disabled for participants, but we will be taking questions and answers at the end of the session. So I would appreciate it if you do have questions that come up for the panelists to please submit them through the Q&A so that we are able to get to them when we get to the 1 o'clock Q&A open session. I know many of you submitted questions when you registered, and we've gotten those, and Sarah will be using them with the board throughout the first part of the panel session. So without further ado, let me introduce Sarah Frances Bland, a graduate of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and currently serving as the executive and board network leaders for the America's Financial Services Organization of Ernst & Young. Sarah is also a member of the Ann Walsh McNulty Institute's Advisory Council, and we were really excited to recognize her reception of the Young Alumni Medal in 2019, and because of COVID, really didn't get a chance to fet that accomplishment. So Sarah, I would like to congratulate you in this public forum on that achievement for all of the work that you've done to support Villanova. So Sarah, thank you very much and welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Terry. Delighted to be here today with this esteemed panel. A big thank you to Villanova and to the McNulty Institute for sponsoring this panel today. And to our audience, it sounds like we have over 250 alumni and friends who will be tuning in. As many of you know, we're going to be covering a number of topics today. And the goal is really to spend the next hour soaking up the shared insights and experiences of this amazing group of panelists. We did want to highlight that the panelists' bios are included in the invitation. We would encourage you to review if you've not already seen their accomplishments and board affiliations in the spotlight, because I think that's a great starting point, and feel free to reference along the way. Just to kick off, I think it's great to do a bit of a lightning round of introductions here. And so if it works, Teresa, why don't you share with us a little bit more about, highlight about yourself, a little bit about your background and current boards.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Teresa Briggs. I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I spent my career at Deloitte. I was there for 37 years, where I ran the West region as one of my last roles. And now I live a portfolio life, is what I have heard it's called. I sit on 5 boards, 4 of them are public, and those include ServiceNow, which is a cloud platform for workflow, DocuSign, which you've probably all used, Snowflake, which just went public in September, and I sit on a SPAC board, which is sponsored by the Virgin Group. And then I also sit on a private company board, which is Warby Parker, and I hope you're all wearing your Warbys.
Thank you. And I believe, Catherine, you're next.
Hi, everybody. I'm Catherine Keating. I have spent my career in finance. I am the CEO of the Wealth Management Division at Bank of New York Mellon. And if you don't know us, we're one of the oldest banks in the country, founded by Alexander Hamilton. I have some public company board experience and also nonprofit board experience. I sit on the board of our national bank here. Before I joined Bank of New York Mellon, I sat on the board of Santander Bank, and I've sat on a half a dozen nonprofit boards over the years. Most particularly relevant here would be the Villanova Board. I'm a grad, and also the board of my law school down at University of Virginia.
Great. Anne, why don't you share with us next?
Thanks, Sarah. I'm 86 grad from Villanova, chemical engineer. I went on to get my PhD and then spent my career with Praxair Linde, the world's largest industrial gas company, just recently retired. I'm on the board of Villanovans Health, which is a large health system here in Connecticut, also spanning into New York. And I'm also on the board of trustees of Villanova, and a mother of 3 daughters.
Wonderful, thank you, Anne. And I think Royce, you're closing us out.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Royce Warrick, and I am a Villanova Law grad, and I'm the mother of 3 daughters. And I am also general counsel, corporate secretary, and senior vice president of a company called Solenis, which is based in Wilmington, Delaware. We are a global provider of chemical materials for water-intensive industries. And we've been a company for about 6.5 years, so it's been quite a journey. I'm on a number of different boards, different types of boards, nonprofit boards, advisory boards, and councils, including the McNulty Institute board. I'm on the board of the American Migraine Foundation, the Delaware Sustainable Chemistry Alliance, and also on the parents board at Georgia Tech. My youngest daughter is at Georgia Tech. I also am the founder of a nonprofit organization that was started to honor my dad, and it's called the Roy Blair Page Foundation. And so I'm founder and a trustee of that organization.
Thank you so much, Royce. And so we've got a lot of ground to cover and just incredible storytelling. Let's kick off. I think that the first question for this group, right, is really going to be around how to demystify that process of securing the first board seat. This question comes up a lot, certainly in my day job, and then the advice and counsel we provide to a number of senior executives and people earlier in their career that are really thinking about staging and focusing there. And no path to the boardroom is the same. How did your first board seat come about? Share with us a little bit more.
Yeah, so the first, what I would call significant board seat has been with Villanovans Health. And I started when I came back from an assignment in Asia, and I was sitting on our executive team at Praxair. My daughters were a little bit older, and I found that I thought I had enough time to start giving back again. When my children were very young, I just was a little bit overstretched. So I said, I have a little bit more time here. I'd like to find a board that I can serve on. And I wanted it to be something that I felt good about and was part of the community. And to be honest, I looked at a couple of boards, and I was a little bit surprised to find that many boards, especially large charitable boards, came with a price tag, right? They wanted somebody, and they used their boards really as their primary source of fundraising. And that really wasn't what I was looking for primarily. I wanted to, and frankly, for some of the boards, I wasn't in the financial situation that they expected for a board member. So I looked at what my company invested in the community. And one of our main charities was our local hospital, Danbury Hospital here. And so I reached out to the head of Danbury Hospital and said, listen, I'd be interested in serving on the board, and they were thrilled. And Danbury Hospital is one of the 7 hospitals in our system now. So I started on the local hospital board, and then eventually grew. I served on our home care board, and then was asked to serve on the system board. So I think my lesson from this is it has to be something that you care about. You have to find a good match. And I was looking for something where my time and experience would be valued, not just writing a check,
Right.
And I also wanted to be on something where I could really see my impact in the community.
That's great, and certainly interesting that it's also connected into your day job, right? There's a community play there that's also a passion play for the organization.
Exactly.
That you're also aligned to. Royce, you shared in our earlier discussions, which I thought was really helpful and interesting, how important it is for leaders to be hyper intentional about their brand and purpose. What was your entree into the boardroom, and how has that intentionality prepared you as a leader?
Well, then starting with, I guess, my first board, quite frankly, was work related. And it was an opportunity while supporting a certain line of our business where I was asked to be on a board. So that was my first, that was my entree into boards and just to understand the governance and what was actually required. And so what I have learned in the journey over a number of years is that number one, you just sort of have to go for it and be very, you talked about intentionality. And so I started to, and this is a part of kind of the lesson I learned that I share with my daughters and tell people basically to do as I'm saying right now, but not necessarily what I actually did because I learned. And I was very much focused on sort of head down, doing the work, taking care of my kids, taking care of my family, and not really looking much more broadly than that. But what I have learned since then is that there is a lot of value in sort of looking up from the focus and being more broad about letting people know of your interests to be on a board, and also actually getting out there and doing it. And so I mentor a lot of young women now who have, some of whom have, 2-year-olds and maybe a 1-year-old. And I tell them, listen, I get it. I didn't do it when I was in your shoes, but you ought to do it. You got to look up and volunteer and begin to develop, understand sort of what you can bring to the table, and just take that step of volunteering and getting involved in community boards or other areas. And so where I started was to tie it to my passion. And my passions are women empowerment and leadership. Yeah, I've got 3 daughters. This is what I just kind of naturally did and do, and education and STEM-based education and science. And so that's where it was easy for me to begin to get traction, really to think about what really touched my heart and what I wanted to in making choices and prioritizing my life. That's where I started. And then, we can go into a lot of the details about what the intentionality looks like and the deliberate focus, but you've got to get out there, get your face out there, see where your interests, what really touches you, where you might be able to add some impact, and tell somebody, let people know
thank you,
of your
Royce.
Interests. Yes.
No, I think that's important. So the passion play, right? We're continuing to build on that and here, those, even the small steps, right? And sometimes not feeling like it's daunting, but looking at where you can make an impact. That's also kind of in that wheelhouse. So that's fantastic. Right. Teresa, let's shift a little bit. You spent significant time presenting to boards, engaging with boards, and actually serving on nonprofits and on Deloitte's board during your tenure. But you were also very focused on translating that experience to the corporate board ecosystem well in advance of your retirement. What did that look like in action?
Yeah, so when I was in my mid-40s, I had the opportunity to work with an executive coach. And he took me through this really interesting exercise where he said, let's go to the end of your career, whenever that is. And let's think about what is it that you want to do after Deloitte. And so I gave it some thought, and my career experiences and my skill sets were really lent themselves to sitting on corporate boards as a financial expert who could run an audit committee. Said I was very interested in business. And so I said, well, I'd really like to sit on boards. So his advice was, okay, we'll spend the next X years of your career, however long that is, being purposeful about that ultimate objective. Do it in a way that benefits Deloitte and benefits you. So with my role, I had the opportunity to meet lots of CEOs and board members. And so that I felt very fortunate because of that role. But I also developed a couple of programs that were aimed at board service. And so one program I started was for executives that wanted to get on their first corporate board. And it was a board readiness program and an educational program where we brought in recruiters and board members to speak. And I learned a lot and they learned a lot, and everyone built their network. And then I started a second group for women who were already sitting on corporate boards. And that was really more like a peer network for them. But again, I learned a ton. I was sitting on the Deloitte board, so I had something to add to that dialogue. But the network that I developed was pretty valuable and really came in handy when I was looking for boards myself once I graduated from Deloitte.
That's so helpful, Teresa. And I think we may circle back with you, right? We really want to dig into the network piece to this. So we know you'll be able to provide some additional perspective there, but interesting about taking that self-initiative to really think about how do you cultivate and curate in a way that's in the wheelhouse. Catherine, we'd like to shift to you. And you previously served on Villanova's Board of Trustees. You've also served on corporate boards throughout your executive career. And you were actually asked to step into the role of board chair for Villanova. So not only did you have a seat at the table, but you were now effectively leading the charge. What was your initial reaction of this ask? And really, how did you go about preparing for that chair role?
So I guess I would say I wish I knew Royce at the time, because if I did, I would have done exactly what she said, which is just go for it, just go for it. But what happened to me is Villanova approached me twice, right? The first time, of course, was to join the board. And it was the chair of the board at the time, Jack Drostick, who was the CEO of Sunoco and somebody I knew through business. He was 20 years older than me. I didn't know him through Villanova. And when he approached me completely out of the blue to join the board, my reaction was, oh, I'm not ready for this. I'm not old enough for this. I'm not wealthy enough for this. And so my advice to everybody listening, when somebody asks you to take on a leadership role, just say yes, because they've already concluded that you can do it. Like, have as much confidence in yourself as everybody else has in you. Unfortunately, I guess I didn't learn enough along the way, because after I'd been on the board a number of years and they asked me to be the board chair, I did the same thing, right? So now I've learned I don't do that anymore. It took me 2 tries and the support of Villanova to get that out of my system. And I remember I was in a taxi here in New York on my way to the airport to go on a business trip, and my phone rings and it's Father Peter. And here's another thing: when Father Peter asks you to do something, you might as well just say yes, because you can't say no to Father Peter. And so he called me and he said, we'd like you to be the board chair. And I said, Father Peter, I'm heading to the West Coast. I've got the 2 kids. My husband has a career. Like, I don't have time to do this. I can't do it. And he said, yes, you can. Yes, you can. So you know what I did? Of course, he was right. He's always right. I served as vice chair for 2 years first, right? So I was easing my way into it before I served as chair. And that's also great advice, because I then had the benefit of learning from 3 great chairs who came ahead of me, right? I could just soak up all the learnings from watching them, great leaders ahead of me. And so that's how it happened.
That's wonderful. The sponge effect.
Everybody here, just say yes. Don't say I'm not ready. You're ready. You're ready.
That's wonderful. And Catherine, we'll probably circle back a little bit in terms of also how that board experience has potentially prepared you for the CEO job, right, that you're in today. Let's shift though. For the audience, some of whom may not be quite as familiar with the role of management in running the business and the role of the board really in that oversight, kind of foresight and strategy capacity. What does this checks and balances look like in action? Royce, you've worn the GC cap for a number of years. Help to share a little bit more about just setting the stage for this group.
Well, I mean, I think the dynamic between the board and management is different for different types of companies, whether we're talking public versus private versus venture capital versus private equity versus nonprofit. It's all very different based on the structure of the organization, but also the culture of the organization. And so my experience has been, and I can only speak to that in the present context. So my company is majority private equity owned. And so that relationship is such that, the company develops the strategy, the company manages the business and executes. The board, this particular board for this private equity is one where there is collaboration on and sort of ideas on how to better execute. There is ultimate approval because of the governance structure, and we're a UK-based company. So ultimately there's that approval. but there's not a lot of, there is not heavy involvement in terms of the day-to-day management. And I think that is probably true in any organization where there's got to be that clear line of demarcation, and it sort of bleeds differently depending on the organization on the board versus the day-to-day management. And so just understanding that for any board that you're looking to be a part of, what is the role of the board versus who's actually running the business or the company, and what value can you bring in that regard. And so that's the way my company operates. I've been in a public company where the board is more governance oriented, and there are some approvals, but they're really not in the day-to-day. They're ultimately making sure that the shareholders of a public company are getting what they need, and that looks different as well, depending on the company.
Thank you, Royce. I think that's really helpful. Let's dig in a little bit to that. And Teresa, maybe we can talk a little bit about your view, right, from the nose and fingers out. But certainly the board ecosystem is large. Public boards, pre-IPO boards, VC-backed, right? You've actually witnessed, Teresa, both in advising and supporting organizations and their boards, but also serving on a myriad of different boards. What notable differences have you seen in how boards operate based on those pretty clear distinctions? And how are they using board members as assets differently, depending upon, once again, that operating style?
Yeah, it's quite different, the venture-backed pre-IPO boards versus the public company boards. So I'll maybe talk about both of those separately and use my boards as an example. So when I joined the Snowflake board, they were private, and then they went public 9 months later. And on Warby Parker, they're still private. So I joined the board 2 years ago, and they're still marching someday towards an IPO. So when you join boards like that, the boards are primarily made up of founders and investors, because if they're not close to an IPO, that's the only type of board they really need. They're just focused on getting the company up and running and the technology proven and the market fit, and they're a startup. So at the point in time when they bring on independent board members, usually they can see a time horizon within which they're going to go public. And so they tend to bring on board members who have a lot of experience as public company board members so that you can guide them through the process of becoming public. So for instance, at Warby Parker, I'm standing up an audit committee. They didn't have an audit committee. They didn't actually need an audit committee as a private company, but they will as a public company. So we've stood up the audit committee, we're developing a charter, we're putting in risk management programs. I mean, there's a lot of governance that has to be put in place when you're in that phase of private to public. And the board plays an important role in advising and coaching the company towards that end. In Warby's case, the founders are 39 years old. This is the only business they've ever run. And so they really rely on the board as coaches and mentors and to bring their skill sets to the table. Now, when you contrast that with the public company boards, my boards are in kind of three different points of maturity. So Snowflake is about 600 million in revenue, recently public. DocuSign's $1.5 billion, 2 years public, and ServiceNow is $5 billion, an S&P 500 company, and they went public in 2012. So, but in each case, the companies are growing at greater than 30%. And in Snowflake's case, it's closer to 100%. So if you can imagine how quickly they have to scale for that rapid growth, the companies are doubling in size every couple of years. The role the board plays is really focused on that scaling. Do we have the right leadership in place if we're going from $1.5 billion to 5 billion or 5 billion to 10 billion? Those leadership capabilities are different. So are we putting the right C-level executives in place? Is our strategy scaling with the growth of the company? Are the controls and systems and processes and governance and compliance, is that all scaling with the company? So instead of leaning in and coaching so much, we're governing, but it's very different than I think you mentioned, Royce, if you're on a really large public company that's quite established like Procter & Gamble or ExxonMobil. I mean, your role is really much more governance than in these earlier stages.
Now that's really helpful. And I think all really important questions to ask early stage, if you're approached about a board or really even thinking about where your time and talents are best leveraged, right? These are important questions to think about because the look and feel and cut and responsibility does shift. We actually have a great audience question. And I think this is in response to kind of the say yes. It's a great question, particularly on corporate boards and for-profits, given the fiduciary responsibility, there can be pitfalls for directors in, from certainly a legal angle as well, in saying yes, right, to those opportunities. So talk us through a little bit about due diligence. Any advice for this group in terms of how do you also make sure that it's the right board and that it's a board that you're comfortable aligning your reputation to, and also an affiliated organization if you're still an active executive?
Do you want me to take that? I'll take a shot at it and then somebody else can jump in. To me, it comes down to the quality of the leadership and the quality of the board and the quality of the product. So when I was looking at companies, I wanted to make sure that I had tons of confidence in the CEO, and that drives a lot of your decision-making as a board member, because that's the person who's leading the company. You're not leading the company as a board member. And then I looked at the quality of the board, and in most cases, I knew at least one or two of the board members of the boards I joined, and that gave me a lot of comfort with the quality of the board. And then to me, it had to be a product that I had a lot of confidence in, and I knew enough about it that I knew where they were placed in the market, what the competitive landscape was, so that I had some confidence that the company was going to be successful. Because where you get into trouble is where, as a board member, is where the company fails, where you have a major brand event, where you do a bad M&A deal. And so I wanted to make sure that the bones of it were good when I joined.
And one other thing, in addition to that, and there's several probably, but one thing that is critical, I think, is, and that I would look at, is the investment level by the board and also senior management in the business. And so because that tells the story of their confidence and whether they've got skin in the game. And that's just another aspect of just the future viability and the trajectory of the company. So that's one other thing that I would definitely focus on.
That's wonderful. I don't know, Catherine or Anne, if you want to shift, or if there's anything to add, feel free to share.
I'll just add one thing. Being on a board these days is quite a tremendous responsibility, whether it's public board or a nonprofit board. And I think even after you do your due diligence, when you're on the board, it is your fiduciary duty to do your homework, right? And ask the right questions and be present. And we've seen some really public examples of when boards were not doing that. And I think as a board member, if you find that you're losing confidence in the leadership, or if the leadership is not being transparent with you, it's a big red flag.
I think that's a great share. And Anne, I think a lot of people.
I'm sorry, just one other thing in terms of the responsibility. You don't have to be a lawyer or a former board member to actually bring yourself up to speed on all this. And so I don't want anybody to talk him or herself out of a position because you've never done it before, and it's the mystery of it is enough to make you stand back. You got to lean into that and do your research and bring yourself up to speed, because you can do it. Everybody can. It's not, don't take me, I don't mean to minimize it. It is critically important, but you can learn it. And so that piece is something that you just have to stay on top of. You can learn it and stay on top of and recognize that responsibility that you have.
That's great. I think this has been fantastic. And once again, feel free to keep these audience questions coming. I think this is really helpful so we can respond to these in real time. As we look at let's call it just the changing board landscape, and certainly the diversity gap that still exists, but certainly is being addressed in a myriad of different ways. Let's first start looking at changing board composition. So this is for our group of panelists. What skills and really attributes are you seeing that are most in demand on today's boards? And do you want to start there, Teresa?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So, long time ago, maybe 10 plus years ago, you saw boards that were mostly made up of CEOs and the CEO's friends. And that was sort of the way boards got formed. It was all through the network of the CEO. And that's changed dramatically. What I'm seeing is, in addition to CEOs, which are still in demand on boards for sure, because they provide a lot of advice and counsel for the CEO of the company, and they just have a lot of operating experience. They're still very much in demand, as are financial experts, which are people like me and CFOs. But in addition to that, I'm seeing a lot of demand for technology executives, so chief technology officers, heads of product, and heads of engineering who really understand, these are tech companies, who really understand technology, but not just on technology companies, because technology is becoming the backbone of every company. I'm also seeing opportunities for chief information officers, because cyber is such an important issue for every company, and typical board members don't have a background in cyber. It's very hard to govern over something that you really don't understand. Chief HR officers are starting to see opportunities because the work of the comp committee has become much more complex, and they want that expertise on the board. So those are some examples of things I'm seeing these days.
Anne?
Yeah, the only other one I would add would be around ESG and sustainability. That's a whole world and community that a lot of traditional boards are not familiar with, and understanding how to adjust your strategy to address some of the concerns from investors around ESG is also in big demand.
And certainly, and also around how are you measuring that, right, in a way that really makes it real, whether that's climate risk or certainly human capital, and across a number of these areas, which is very interesting to look at, and communicating that effectively, right, continues to be a real challenge for a lot of boards. Catherine, skill sets you're seeing?
Yeah, sure. So one thing I would add is, as the U.S. economy has transitioned from being an industrial economy to a service economy, really, 70% of our economy is consumers. People who know consumers are much in demand on boards, right? People who wear glasses or whatever on Warby Parker for Teresa, but recognize that people who know segments of the consumer world and how consumers buy and make decisions are incredibly valuable on boards today.
That's great. Royce, your view?
Well, I mean, I agree with what everyone has said. One thing I would add, and this is not that it's necessarily required, but I think it is, it's a plus that everyone should think about developing, and that is financial and business acumen. And you don't have to have an MBA to get that and to develop that. I mean, there are, for my team, for instance, here at Solenis, for the legal team, in terms of building business savvy legal professionals, send folks to courses. There are several sort of fundamental books, fundamentals on finances and financials, and being able to read a balance sheet and being able to read a P&L and understanding it. And that is in addition to the rest of your value proposition, right? Of whatever that looks like, but having that business foundation and that savviness, if you will, I think is just a critical plus that may not be required, but when you bring that with what is required to the table, I think it's just it amplifies your value.
No question. So let's shift a little bit, right? And we may come back to really understanding some of the factors at play, particularly within the US and even globally, around public policy efforts, NASDAQ, right, creating a new proposed rule change to really drive better diversification on boards. We'll come back to that, but let's shift. One additional barrier to board entry has been, and Teresa, you alluded to this, that long-standing reality that a lot of board appointments come through referrals from the CEO or the board itself. And while I think we're all in agreement, it's not kind of the CEO's friends anymore, that's certainly come under scrutiny for a number of years. We continue to see kind of that self-sourcing and the reality that a lot of new board members, new to that ecosystem, really have someone endorsing them behind the scenes. Royce, let's just get your perspective on this. What advice do you have for aspiring directors who don't know where to start in really building that trusted network of influence?
Well, the first thing I think you need to look to and figure out is how to make a connection with some of these recruiting firms. Now, granted, there are a lot of what the channel that comes to boards is really, it's all about sort of the network. Sorry, in my office, this building long enough and you don't move, the lights go out. But so being intentional about developing that relationship, but also, again, it's all about kind of the deliberate networking and getting yourself out there, joining, volunteer to be on a panel to speak to a group of people where you develop, a couple of people who you meet, and next thing you know, you're on another board. I mean, when I was asked to be a part of the McNulty Institute Leadership Council, I mean, that was wonderful because I just wanted to do that because, again, it goes to my passion. It's Villanova, it's women's leadership and empowerment, and that was great. But it also was a springboard to other organizations and meeting people through those organizations. And it is about reaching out through whatever means. And right now, in this context with COVID, it is so much easier to actually connect with people and to get on. You don't have to get in your car, and you don't lose a day by going to New York or wherever we might have been. It would have been great to be there, but I've already been in 4 Zoom calls today, right? So it's much easier to develop that network, and it's one person at a time. And when you start doing this, I was just pleasantly surprised how all of a sudden it just sort of happened, and of the connections that you make. And probably still 85–90% of board placements are through kind of connections, and maybe not CEOs friends, but connections. So being deliberate about getting out there.
Just to give you a sense, EY's done some work in this space. I mean, we typically see about
you got to do the same. That's right. It's a mutually beneficial relationship, but you got to get out there and do it. And it's so much easier in the COVID virtual world where connections are use less of your resources and your time, quite frankly. And so.
So that's great. So Anne, I mean, and just to mention, we typically see about 70% of a lot of board landings coming from someone I think that the bigger question is how do we empower others to turn that on its head? And how are you more hyper visible to the marketplace beyond the walls of the organization in which you're leading in? And if you can share with us a little bit, where have you found your biggest allies as it relates to opening doors to boards and other influential leadership roles?
Yeah, I think you can find allies everywhere. Generally, it's people who know how you work. I think, Royce mentioned working in professional organizations or through professional organizations to expand your network in your world, but outside your company. I found great allies in former customers, people that I had worked with years ago, but and had been through often some tough times, some tough negotiations and crises, things like that. And you bond with people through that, and they can see what you're made of. So I think you can find allies everywhere. My boss was a great ally. Our board members at Lindy have been great allies to me. So I think you can find allies in a lot of different ways. I think a lot of times where we struggle is leveraging those relationships. I think a lot of times you build this network and then maybe you're a little bit shy about using that network. And that's sometimes where we need a little push. People who you've worked with, who respect you, they don't mind, going to bat for you. So they just need you to ask that.
So I think that's really interesting, that the tact. Teresa, let me dig in here a little bit. You had mentioned previously that you convened a group of current board members, and you took that self-initiative that also then opened a pathway to individuals that were certainly influential in their decision-making and maybe referring people throughout the ecosystem at large. And you really gave back to that group, right? You were helping them with issues that they were facing as well. How can you think about kind of the give proposition? How has that helped in your role? And have you noticed that any of those directors that you started to network with, have they played a role as you were starting to shift from Deloitte to this portfolio career on boards?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. As I built this network of these female board members, it got to a point where they would come up to me individually to say, "You've done so much for us to just bring us together. We have this kind of safe place to have these really rich dialogues. What can we do for you?" And I kept promising them, "I promise you'll get a chance to help me when I'm outside of Deloitte and I can finally join boards." And as it turned out, some of them were on the boards of companies I got invited to interview for. And it helps so much to have an ally on the inside of a board when you're interviewing to join that board, because they can vouch for you from, their personal experience. They know you. And as much as I like to say, joining a board is a fair playing field, it is a lot about relationships, and it's a lot about the board culture and how you integrate into that board culture. And so it's been very helpful. I wanted to note that about 30% of board placements come through search firms, and the remaining 70% are really through these networks we've been talking about. And so it can feel kind of daunting. Well, I don't know any search firms and I don't know any CEOs and board members, but there are ways that you can start to build those networks. You can join nonprofit boards, which all of us have done, and you meet amazing people on nonprofit boards that are executives in companies or members of boards. And I always encourage people to take a leadership role on a nonprofit board, because then you have even more influence and you have the ability to make those connections even tighter. There are board ready programs. I know a number of them, Him for Her, Women 2050, the Athena Alliance. Most of the big four firms have board ready programs. I mean, there's a lot of board ready programs out there where you can learn about the board process and build your network. So it is a lot of work, but I found that as I put effort into it, I certainly got a lot back myself, but I also felt like I was helping other people. So it's a pay it forward thing too. Like once you get there, you turn around and pull in the next generation.
No question. And we continue to see, right, it's also challenging to think even outside of the comfort zone. So there are certain benefits, right, to I think connecting with people we feel most comfortable with. It may be other women directors, individuals that there are established relationships. Don't forget the men, right? And don't forget the reality that that there is still a disparity on a lot of these boards. And so how do you also think about creating and engaging in a way that may make someone lean in to that opportunity to sponsor you? We continue to think about that in a pretty strategic way. So you're really armed with thinking a little bit more holistically about that network as well. Catherine, shed some light for us, particularly in terms of everyone is affiliated with Villanova in some way, or most of us on this call. What about leveraging the Villanova network?
Yeah, so I will talk about that. I just want to add one thought to the audience on women on boards. We're having this conversation because it's the week of the Big East, but the truth is we're having it in Women's History Month, right? March is Women's History Month. And I had the fun of hosting a panel earlier this week with Bernice King, who heads the Martin Luther King Center down in Atlanta. And she said something that was so inspiring. I just want to share it, which is, this is the century of the woman. If you think about where women are in society today versus where we were 100 years ago when we were just getting the right to vote, this is the century of the woman. And it's going to be the century of women on boards too. And I think it's because for the first time in my life, I see the laws of supply and demand all in our favor, right? The demand for women on boards is higher than I've ever seen, because the case for diverse leadership, the business case is so clear. There's just simply no question. Shareholders want to see it. So demand is high, board governance is stronger. So you see boards being refreshed more regularly, term limits, age limits. And so there's more turnover. And there's also more supply. Look at the 300 people on this call today, right? Professional women who can contribute to boards. So I have a tremendous amount of optimism. The Villanova Network, it can help you all the way, guys. It can help you all the way. Villanova changed my life. It brought me to the campus with a presidential scholarship, paid for my education, gave me opportunities I would never have. I met my husband, got married in the chapel. Look at all of you. We're all here together. So Villanova will keep changing your life. I promise you, after you leave campus, if you just continue to build that broad network. The people from Villanova who have helped me on boards weren't in my class. They were 20 and 25 years ahead of me, but I met them through this wonderful network and they became allies. And so I would just suggest to everybody, let Villanova continue to change your life, because it will, all throughout your professional career.
No question. I think that the Villanova pay it forward here, we can all testify to that. So that's great. Let's circle back there, Catherine. If you don't mind, returning to you, let's talk progress and let's also talk pain points, right? If you look at large public companies, you are seeing actual notable strides, right? Particularly around S&P 500 boards. You mentioned that, the laws of supply and demand. We currently have 30% of all independent director seats, that's women, that are represented as of March of this year. If you go back 10 years, it was actually 19 0.6%, I think. So we've seen really big strides over the past decade. What factors do you see propelling this change? And where does kind of like, stakeholder capitalism play into this as well? How much of that is investor driven, policy driven? How much of it do you think is the demand by consumers, which you referenced earlier, employees and the like, to really see themselves represented on boards?
I think it's a combination of all of those things. One of the things that has just become indisputable over the last decade is, as I said before, the business case for diversity. We know that diverse leadership teams and diverse boards have higher returns on capital. We know that diverse sales teams have better sales results. And obviously, we're in a consumer economy that really matters. We know, I'm in the investment business, we know that diverse investment teams have better investment results. So the case for diversity is clearer than it's ever been. And now you're seeing all the stakeholders, rallying around it, right? Your own employees want to see a diverse board, right? Your shareholders want to see a diverse board. If you are a regulated industry, I'm in a regulated industry, your regulators want to see diversity. So I will go back to Bernice King. This is the century of the woman, and I will add my own part, which is I think it's also the century of the women on boards. I really do.
That's wonderful. Teresa, weigh in here on the private side of the house, and Royce would love your view there too, given the PE-backed alignment here. But we do see less notable growth, much more stagnant, right? So we continue to see that half of high growth private boards, this is actually a him for her study, still have no women represented. And the representation of women of color is actually particularly concerning. I think it's about 3%. Is the diversity gap finally gaining prioritization on the board's agenda? How are we seeing those shifts play out? And interestingly, right, Teresa, you're also on a lot of tech boards. So what does that look like kind of in action? And where are you seeing that discussion take place that maybe didn't happen a couple years ago?
Yeah, so it depends on the life cycle of the private board. When you look at diversity, because in the early stages of these companies, as I mentioned before, the boards are mostly founders and investors. And if you look at the number of investing partners in venture capital and private equity, it's pretty low. So most of the boards, when they're early stage, are mostly men, unfortunately. But what I am seeing and what gives me hope is that as these boards become closer, as these companies become closer to public companies, and they add their independent directors, they are adding diverse independent directors. And they're doing that for all the reasons that you mentioned earlier. For instance, Goldman Sachs has come out publicly to say they won't take a company public unless the board is diverse. NASDAQ is trying to implement some diversity requirements for listings. The rating agencies for public companies are looking at board diversity. The larger, broader investor community, the institutional investors are looking for diversity. So these private companies get it. They know they need to diversify their boards. I can't say in all cases they drank the Kool-Aid on diversity is business imperative, like Catherine noted. But I think over time, as they mature and they experience a more diverse board, they understand the benefits of it. So definitely seeing change, but at that end point when they're getting ready to go public. On the tech boards, if you're in California, California passed a law a couple of years ago that mandates a certain mix of gender diversity on boards, and then most recently passed a law that mandates other elements of diversity on boards. And you can have a big debate about mandates. Are they good? Are they bad? But the reality is it has changed the diversity mix on boards in California, and other states are putting similar measures in place. And so on my boards, I have 30 or 40% women on all of my boards, including my private board, by the way. So I think that's pretty good. We're not at 50 yet, but that's certainly the aspiration, and we're marching towards it. And I don't see anyone saying, we already have 3 women out of 10, we're done. I'm not seeing that. I think that still exists, but on my boards, I'm not seeing it. And partly because we have a female NomGov chair on 2 of my 3 boards. And when a woman gets the chairmanship in NomGov, they then control the pipeline, and they have a lot of influence on adding diverse board members. And I'm seeing that make a big difference.
No question. And I think we are certainly seeing nominating in Gov and compensation committee, right, as it relates to looking at some creative measures to really drive diversity, that then leads to better business performance, right? Which I think is important from Catherine's earlier point. We actually have we're not fully opening up to Q&A yet, but I think we do have a great question, more related to really the past 12 plus months, particularly around COVID, around boards in crisis, around boards really having to shift to think a little differently about their operating model. For all of you, what have you seen that has really been the toughest issues you've been dealing with as a board member over the past, let's call it 12 months since COVID really took hold, and we've really had to think a little differently in terms of staying relevant and also obviously effectively operating in this environment. Royce or Anne? Yeah, Anne, go ahead.
If you don't mind, as a board member of a healthcare network, obviously we were in crisis on multiple levels. One was in addressing the COVID crisis, and then a secondary crisis, which was loss of revenues, right? We're a nonprofit, but we still have to, cover our costs and try to make some margin. So it was a two-pronged crisis. And along with that, how do you manage that kind of crisis and also be true to your mission, right? Which is around equitable care for the entire community. So we had a lot of discussions around, we have a small endowment, how much of our endowment do we dip into during this time? Are we really in survival mode? How long can we last? Things as drastic as, do we have enough cash on hand? How do we adjust our employee pool? So it has absolutely been something in which the board has gotten involved, not in the day-to-day management, but really ensuring that the system maintains its commitment to the mission, and that the board and our investment committee can give the management the latitude to make those decisions and survive.
And I would add something to that too. Most of us have been working long enough that we've been through lots of crises, right? Whether it's 9/11, the global financial crisis, now we've had this. This is of a different scale than any of us have ever seen, right? A pandemic is a uniquely human crisis that impacts every person who's a constituent of yours. And this is the first crisis that we've had to go through together, but separated, right? Normally you think about a crisis, I think about the financial crisis, and I think about those 20-hour days in the office, all of us together trying to deal with it. We couldn't do that. We had to transition to people working at home, 90% of our employees. And so we had to figure out how to do that. And I think what every board has figured out, and our board and our CEO figured out, when you have a crisis like that and you're trying to pull people together separately, you have to be really clear on priorities. What are the three things that really matter? I heard you just speak to that, Anne, and we did that too. Number one, health and safety of employees. Number two, service to our clients. Number three, protect the company and our communities. And we rallied around those three things all year. And we changed the way we worked, right? Different meeting, waterfall of meetings, et cetera, new ways of communicating. But you've got to figure out a way to pull everybody together when we're all separate. And I think that was a unique leadership lesson for boards and management everywhere.
And I can share sort of two sides of the coin. So with Warby Parker, they have 130 retail stores, and about 2/3 of their revenue comes from retail versus online. You might think it's the opposite because they started direct to consumer, but retail is really important. And so on March 16th, they shut down 100% of their retail stores, and that revenue went to zero. And they're a late stage venture-backed company where investors, have a lot of say in the decision making. And so the discussion at the board level was, what do we do about our employees? And I was really proud of that board, especially given that there were a lot of investors at the table whose money was at stake. They said, no, we have to do the right thing for our employees. Let's keep them on until we figure out what government benefits are going to be available to them. And they kept their employees on for most of the shutdown. And then they made up the difference between what they were making and what the government benefits were. And so it was aligned with their purpose. And so when you're tested as a company in a situation like this, you really start to understand, do you live your values, or are they just on a piece of paper? And in that case, I really saw that, management and the board were aligned around living the values and the kind of the purpose of that company. On the flip side, in tech, in cloud software, it was a boom because all of a sudden, with every employee around the world having to work from home, companies needed services like DocuSign like never before. They needed to be able to sign remote documents. So their business went crazy. And so the challenge on that board was quite different. It was around how do we make sure we can capture all this growth and do it in a quality way and serve our customers in their time of need. Given that you can't add employees at the pace that you're growing. So, the employee base got stretched really thinly, like in every business, but it was for a reason that's sort of counterintuitive, given you're in a pandemic. It was because of hypergrowth.
Great.
Like I said, the only thing I would add to all of the discussion about this past year, probably a year and a half for many, is just that the recognition of and the potential value and how to factor into what you can bring to the table in terms of your value proposition and how you have navigated through all of this. So as you're thinking about everybody on this call, what can I bring to the table? And I can speak specifically, and this is a small segment, but it's an example, for instance, for lawyers who traditionally have not been sort of, people are not going out and trying to bring lawyers onto boards, quite frankly. And so just thinking about the value proposition and how that has changed for what you can bring to the table based on your role this year for helping to navigate, whether it's EH&S and regulatory and HR and the traditional legal pieces, particularly in a global environment, and being able, that agility and that ability to manage through that, even if it's a small piece, just recognizing the potential value that you can bring and how that enhances your profile and your value proposition of what you can bring to a company. Because I think that a lot of companies are still looking for, we recognize this is like once in a lifetime, but still recognizing the value that can be brought to bear by people who have certain expertise and have driven processes that have helped to manage through that on the board side. Recognizing management manages the company, but boards can bring expertise to the table that those members or potential members have learned and navigated through crises like what we've lived through this year.
I think that's great, Royce. And as you talk about brand, one question for the audience, because I think we can shift here. We're getting some great audience feedback and we want to make sure that we capitalize on this time. Once you really feel like, look, I understand my value proposition that I'm bringing to a board. The question is, how do you get the message out there about your intentions to join a board? Do you really need a supporter, mentor, or multiple? What does that really look like? And Catherine, can you share with us a little bit of perspective there on how to do that tactfully, but in a way that's really effective in really, once again, kind of branding yourself for this type of hard to acquire seat?
I think it's having people think of you in that way, right? When you really think about it, we all, over our careers, build very large networks. But I'm struck by what Teresa said. She was very intentional working with her coach, thinking about, what might I want to do in the future? And don't expect everybody else to know you the way you know yourself, right? Feel free to say, here's what I aspire to over time, and to ask their advice. What would you do if you were me? What could be standing in the way? How could I, make them your advisor? There's nothing like having a lot of great advisors and really listening and positioning yourself that way, because every board is looking for something a little bit different. You've got to understand what's the gap they're trying to fill, what's the need that they have, how could you fill it? And again, it's about, somebody once said to me, it's about being out in traffic, in the sense that just knowing people, talking to people, having people think of you as being in traffic, we'll get your name, sort of surface for some of these things.
That's wonderful. And I will say, just from living and breathing board members for a number of years, the curiosity that you see, right? This ability to really be a sponge. They're soaking up so many interesting things. And so some of that as well is making sure that you're really thinking through the role of the board in thinking holistically, looking at geopolitical risk, looking at a lot of these myriad of factors and how they all intersect, particularly as we see public and private intersection happening at a much faster rate. So I think for a lot of people too, it's really thinking through that area. And Catherine, that's great advice. In terms of,
and also, can I just add one thing? Sometimes it's as simple as, and what one of the processes that I went through is to list who is in my network. Whether it's former colleagues, current colleagues, softball parents, soccer parents, people from the church, college alumni. It's just the network. And when I started doing that and categorizing people, the network was vast. And then I started calling people and letting them know, hey, listen, I'm starting this journey and I'm thinking about this way in terms of board seats. What's your thought? A lot of these folks are, they're running companies or they're on boards. What do you see? How should I be thinking about this? Just sort of kicking ideas around. And it is just from that type of conversation where people know, number one, that you're interested. Number two, they want to help you. And number three, as everybody has said, basically, it lets people know who you are and that you are potentially top of mind for them as they're thinking about board seats. So sometimes it's just that simple of making a list and picking up the phone.
Yeah, and don't neglect your own manager at work, right? Because
that's right.
The board actually makes you a much stronger employee, even if it's a nonprofit board. The first major board I was on was actually the Villanova Board. And all of a sudden you understand that boards work differently than management, right? In a company, you've got your assignment, your team, you make decisions, you move on. Boards work by consensus. Very, very different. And by the way, as a board chair, you have to drive consensus. And a lot of that does not happen in the boardroom. It happens outside the boardroom because you just don't meet for that many hours. And so don't forget that your manager can be your biggest ally and help you, secure one of these seats, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, and have their own skin in the game because it's going to make you a better employee.
So I think it's a great highlight. I also think sometimes we hear people very concerned about engaging with outside boards because it's going to take away from the day job. If anything, it should be a real asset to the day job. And in many ways, cut your teeth a little differently from a leadership angle. Anne, can you share some thoughts there in terms of how that has maybe impacted you in your own leadership role, gaining a lot of this outside of the day job experience?
Yeah, I think that, as has been mentioned, you just meet incredible people from very diverse backgrounds. On my nonprofit board, I've met people in private equity, CEOs of public companies, CEOs of private companies, family companies. So it gives you a different perspective. Sometimes, I spent my whole career in the same company. You tend to, I don't want to use the word groupthink, but you have a certain way of thinking and a certain way of doing things. And by getting outside of that mold and seeing how other organizations work, not just the organization that you're on the board for, but how other leaders think and how other leaders approach problems is really helpful.
I think that's really great advice. What about advisory board experience? A question from the audience: how valuable do you think getting advisory board experience is? This particular individual has been solicited by a company, but it looks like you have to pay for them to introduce you. So we've talked about search firms. We haven't really talked about kind of this emerging ecosystem of players that are really trying to get kind of pay for introduction type service. I don't know if anyone has experienced that or has a view, but both questions. Advisory board experience, can that be equally valuable as the fiduciary role or kind of that nonprofit director seat?
I could take a shot at that. So I think putting the paid part of the advisory board aside, because I think that's a little unusual, but if you have the opportunity to join an advisory board and it fits with your objectives, whether it's in the sector you're in or it's someplace you think you can add value, by all means, and you have the time to do it, I would do it because it's going to give you some experience that you don't already have. Whether I would pay to do it, I'd have to really understand what I'm paying for. I don't quite understand that model. On the other side, on reverse search, where you pay a search firm to find boards for you, I do know people who have done that and it's been very successful, but you want to make sure that, because it's quite expensive, that you really need it. Because if you have a network that you can develop and cultivate on your own, then you should do that. if you feel like you just don't have the network and you feel like that would be a good route for you, make sure it's a firm that has a really great track record. Check references, talk to people they've worked with before you lay down money for that. Because there's so many routes to boards. I'd say that's a decent route. It's an expensive route. So do your diligence.
That's great. We got another question. I'm nearing the end of my first nonprofit board term. What are some good ways to seek new opportunities to serve? So coming to the end of the term, how does this particular individual, this is Ivy, how does she think a little bit about that next terrain?
I would say the best source are her current, other people that are on the current board, right? Because you'll find that people who serve on nonprofits or charitable boards often serve on more than one. And they may have goals and values that are aligned with your own. So I would certainly make sure that other people on that board know that you're interested in continuing that service, and try to identify other things in your community. I'm a big proponent that the closer you can get to your own community, the better and more relevant you'll be. So I would start there.
And I would add, serving on a board is a job, whether you're paid or not. It may be a nonprofit board, but it's still a job, and you still have the responsibility of being a good board member that's devoting the time and being informed and, leading strategically and all of those things. And so I would also say, what kind of job do you like? Where do you think you add value? Where do you have expertise? What makes you excited? Whether it's paid work or not paid work. Just recognize that it is a job. And so therefore, focusing on something where you're happy to spend the time, but you also think that you've got the expertise to add value, even if it's in the nonprofit world, is very important.
That's great, Catherine. And just to weigh in, and I don't know if anyone wants to share here, there's a great question in terms of, can you elaborate how you're actually paid to serve on a corporate board? And similarly, the give-get model in a lot of privates, just helping to understand a little bit for some of the audience members who may not currently be serving. What does that kind of look like in action? Teresa?
Yeah, it varies, but in general, for a public company board, you're usually paid in some combination of cash and stock. And the stock is usually, by the time they're public, RSUs, and you're probably familiar with them in your day jobs. And they're usually 1 year vest. So you'll get an annual RSU grant that vests in 1 year, and then you'll get cash. With tech companies, it's very disproportionately leaning towards stock. So it's like 80% stock, 20% cash. But in more consumer companies, which I'm also familiar with, sometimes it's more half and half. And so you can look at proxy statements. If you're curious, you can pull any company's proxy statement, and the board compensation is listed in the proxy statement. On private company boards, it's more like the wild, wild west out there. It varies dramatically. It depends on how early you get into the company, and the earlier you get in, the more stock you get, and you usually get stock options. And the later you get in, the less you get, and it can be RSUs if you're really close to the IPO date. And so there's just really no guidepost out there. I know Andreessen Horowitz has put out a guideline that says, as a private company board member, you should get 1/4 to 1% of the company, depending on how early you're in. So the earlier, the greater, and the later, the less. But I honestly don't know very many board members that get 1%. That's a lot of stock. If you get 1/4%, that's still quite a big stock grant for a board member. So I would talk to people in your industry. Like if you get an opportunity on a private board, talk to other people that sit on private boards in that industry to get a sense for what the comp is. And you might be able to circle around something that feels fair. But on the public company side, you can definitely benchmark it because it's all publicly available.
That's great. And Teresa, before we let you go, there's actually an interesting question. SPACs are all the rave. And there is a question actually pointedly, how was the experience of being on a SPAC board and a high profile one at that different than your other board roles? Do you mind sharing that?
Yeah, it's very, very different. So for one thing, it has a fixed term because the SPAC can only exist for 2 years. And if it doesn't invest the money it's raised, it de-SPACs and gives the money back to its investors. So you kind of know you have a fixed term. Sometimes you can go on to serve on the public company board once you merge a target into a SPAC, but that's not guaranteed, and that's something you'd want to ask up front if that's the intention when you join the SPAC board. So that's one thing. Two, it doesn't look at all like a regular company corporate board, in the sense that there are committees, because there have to be, because it's a public entity, but the committees in my case never met separately. We just had a board meeting. We covered all board business in the board meeting. The board meetings were about an hour versus typical board meetings can be, 4 to 8 hours plus committees. So the time commitment is way, way less. And the reason is, all a SPAC is it's cash until it finds an M&A deal. So you're governing over cash, which is pretty easy. And then the big lift is really when they do an M&A transaction. And then it's like governing over an M&A transaction in any company, where you want to make sure that you understand the investment thesis, the pricing is right, the diligence was done, the merger terms are appropriate, and that sort of thing. So I would say it's a shorter duration. It's less time intensive. It's super, super interesting because, when it's in the Wall Street Journal every day, it's kind of fun to be part of learning about it. And then the economics are quite attractive for board members because you participate in the sponsor economics. So not to go too deep into any of that, but yeah, if you get an opportunity, I would definitely look at it, but make sure you understand the risk.
No question. And that is wonderful. I think we have one more left. And the question is really about term limits, right? So a mechanism by which boards are refreshed. What does that look like on corporate boards? And I guess the specific question here, right, is what is happening with term limits on boards? Or is there a lot of attention around this and maybe the lack of term limits on boards as an issue with not allowing for more regular refreshment, particularly as digital transformation and organizations are really having to metamorphosize candidly in this environment. Does anyone want to weigh in on that question?
So I'm happy to weigh in. I think that it is, and I'm sure you have the data to confirm this, Sarah, that it is more and more common to see term limits on boards. There's a recognition that the world changes very rapidly, and you need to refresh your board and get fresh perspectives to deal with, today, tomorrow, the future, recognizing how quickly the world moves. One thing that I've noticed is that term limits are becoming more common than age limits. It's also being recognized that you can add value, from a very long time over the course of your life. And so I'm seeing term limits becoming more common than age limits, but I'm sure, Sarah, you have the data to confirm that.
Yeah, no question. And I think some of this as well is we are seeing boards shift in terms of how they think about refreshment and really building the pipeline in advance of the seat becoming open, right? And so succession planning is definitely an area that we are really seeing coming under a little bit of scrutiny. I think the nominating committee chairs, right? We're seeing a real engagement around this topic in a different light. And I think a lot of it is driven by candidly, right, sometimes the lack of mechanisms in place on the board, the need for that, and the value that I think a lot of fresh perspectives are giving to boards, particularly managing through crises like we've been managing through over the past year. So thank you. This is incredible questions from the audience. So certainly thank you to so many people for tuning in here. Thank you to this incredible panel. We look forward to seeing continued progress in really addressing some of the gaps that we outlined today at the board leadership level, and certainly would encourage everyone on this call, as our panelists so clearly stated today, to a couple highlights. I think look up, Royce, sharing that perspective is great. We can certainly make this a little easier on ourselves in thinking through this from the look up and small step angle, saying yes, doing that due diligence when doing that, but making sure that once that diligence is there, having the confidence to step into that seat, and certainly starting early. I think those pieces are all pretty poignant, and certainly all things that allow for leaders to grow and expand their own brand, their value proposition exponentially. So thank you again. I think you've all been incredible at helping us all think about creating very real, very tangible, and very unique pathways to these seats of influence. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Terry now for the wrap.
Sarah, thank you so much for doing this amazing job moderating this panel. Thank you, Teresa, Anne, Catherine, Royce. What great stuff. As I was saying to Sarah in the chat, my phone and email were blowing up with people saying, this program is amazing. We need to do this all the time. So lots of good feedback already. For those of you who are in attendance, I wanted to, thank Anne for recognizing that it is Women's History Month, and as such, talk about a couple of opportunities. If this is a topic that you are interested in, particularly around developing your skills that would be appropriate as you look to develop your own leadership, I have a couple of opportunities that I'd like to share with you. One is during Women's History Month, the Institute is offering a number of events, one on building a smart network, which will be in a couple of weeks. It's an actual workshop on tools and strategies to do that. You heard that mentioned a number of times as something that is critical to being able to achieve board positions. The other is that the Institute for Women's Leadership, in partnership with the College of Professional Studies at Villanova University, is launching its first certificate program in women's leadership development to be set this fall in residence at the Ind for 3 different weekends with individual coaching and programming in between those sessions. More information about that program and how to apply is on the Institute's website. Everyone received a link to the website with their registration confirmation, so you should be able to go there and find out more about it. Applications are open now for that, and you will be able to know by this summer whether or not you've been accepted to the program. We're really excited about it, and you will see information there on skill development towards boards. Last but certainly not least, we will be posting some resources that both the panelists and others in the Q&A shared on women and board development on the Institute's website. If you go to our past events page, those will be up tomorrow. So this is a different list of things. Again, if this is a topic that you're interested in, you can follow up by learning more on your own or by applying to participate in our Women's Leadership Development Certificate program. Once again, thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to Villanova Advancement and Villanova University for hosting this Let's March Nova program. Have a great week, everyone, and let's hope we do a little better next year in the Big East tournament. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry.